Okay, how is Westminster, the City of London, Parliament, British imperialism, how's that operating today?
How it's operating? I think it's operating on a number of levels. It is and it has for the last 500 years operated in a way that's developed a conceptual approach, an ideological approach, right? In a moral or immoral and unethical approach, you can say as well. I'm just going to go back, I suppose, 5 centuries and just talk about the genesis of what Britain is, because Britain today is a global institution. It doesn't just pertain and impact the people who live on the British Islands, the British Isles, but it impacts the globe. As somewhat of a cliche, the sun never set on the British Empire. And as our friend George would say, that's because God never trusts them in the dark, right? But so it started off with a war against the peasants, against the working classes at the time, which were the poor peasants, the enclosures, taking common lands by force and removing by force the peasants. Part of the leadership of the peasant communities were women with intergenerational knowledge systems and healing and leaders of the community. So with the enclosures and the war against the peasants was also a war against women, where millions of women were killed in the so-called witch hunts. And the reason I'm starting there, in terms of understanding what British imperialism is today, this is the genesis of British democracy and British capitalism, and British colonialism and imperialism. It started with a war against women within this island first, and a war against the poor within this island first. And actually, those conceptual systems of oppression and physical forms of oppression, for example, the torture contraptions they used on their war against women, was used, the exact contraptions were used against the so-called slaves of Africa that the British enslaved, right? So what they've done, historically, they've perfected and done to a greater degree against the colonized peoples. So these women and these peasants were still considered humans, but when it came to the people of Africa and the enslavement, the industrial enslavement and genocide against African peoples, then they were seen as cattle, literally to be numerically counted with their cows and goats and other goods, right? So fast forward to today, they're still operating on that conceptually. Women, there's still a war against women and girls, there's still a war against the working classes, and there's a much bigger war against the people of the planet that British imperialism is impacting. What I'm saying is the British and Americans who are fanning the flames of sectarianism throughout the so-called Muslim world and fanning the flames of sectarianism here in Britain. And they've, unfortunately, the British media and state have successfully brainwashed the British people, particularly the English working class people, in thinking this Western projected perversion version of Islam, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, is what Muslims are. And if Britain First and UKIP and all these people who have a visceral hatred against Muslims and anyone coming from outside this island, if they understood that Britain is not in a war on terror, it's involved in a war of neo-colonial terrorism, in promoting and working with the very forces that they're saying they oppose, if they could understand that the British state is primarily responsible for founding the state of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies, who are all promoting Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So,
well, but that just leaves my head spinning.
Listen, these are the biggest masters of war and deception that has ever been known on the planet to humanity. But bringing it back to the Scotland dynamic, right, Mark? Which I know you've been doing some great campaigning on. See, that external colonialism has an internal manifestation as well. And the first to be colonized by English colonialists was the Welsh, the Scots, and famously the Irish 800 years ago. But that anti-colonial struggle around the globe now has come back onto this island itself, where the Scottish popular consciousness is not xenophobia, misogyny, and racism, and militarism, and materialism, as it is in England. But the popular consciousness, as you know very well, is a progressive consciousness, is an inclusive one, not an exclusive one, is a pro-migration one, not an anti-immigrant one, is an anti-war one, not a pro-war one. So that is now defining the political landscape and the conversation increasingly on this island. And thank God we've lived to see this day where it's come to pass, where it's not solely a right-wing trajectory, where we actually have a progressive, anti-colonial, socialist-oriented conversation that's been developed thanks to the Irish historically and now the Welsh and the Scots.